Welcome back. Now, National Treasury said that South Africa's decision to sell a majority stake in the country's national airline is a financial risk to the state. Now, this because the terms were allegedly in favor of the consortium, Takatso, whose 51% share in SAA represents contingent liability. Now, that was according to National Treasury in a document that was emailed to Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts, SCOPA, and it was later withdrawn. Now, Takatso allegedly has the right to assess whether any ongoing liabilities in SAA be settled by government, and the terms may result in the state providing funds in excess of its shareholding. So, for a better understanding of the dynamic of this deal, we're joined by chartered accountant and commentator, analyst Kaya Sitole, who joins us from London. Kaya, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone.
So we've seen the headlines this week, SAA sold for 51 Rand. Let's start there, because for the longest time, it seemed as though everyone was chasing after the details of this particular deal between the government and Takatso Consortium. So was it sold for 51 Rand? And please explain to us how that works out.
Well, I wouldn't say it was sold for 51 Rand. So what we've ended up with is a structure where the Department of Public Enterprises has obviously, well, at least they'd like us to believe, undergone through a process of trying to establish the best and the most optimal way of managing SAA going forward. So what they then said is that they had looked at different bids that had been proposed to them, all in secret, and they had emerged with the answer that Takatso Consortium were the best placed people to actually partner with the state in managing the affairs of SAA going forward. And immediately how that arrangement was put together is that there was going to be a split ownership model where Takatso would own 51% of the airline and the state would retain a 49% stake. And of course, Takatso would be the one that runs the affairs of the airline. So that is the information that we were given last year. But obviously, even at that point in time, it was very unclear what the value of the deal was. And of course, when we talk about the value of the deal, it simply meant that we needed to know what the value of SAA was at the point in time that the transaction was being proposed. And the reason why that mattered is that, of course, once we know that the value is 10 Rand and then we hear that they paid 10 Rand for it, that should have been the end of the story, because clearly it's a fair deal. We as citizens would have got exactly what the asset was worth. Now, obviously, in the absence of clear information about the value of SAA at that point in time, it simply means that we do not know whether indeed the stake was sold for what we could deem to be an equitable and a fair price. And the reason it's important for it to be an equitable and a fair price is that, remember, citizens of the country have pumped billions of rands into SAA over extended periods of time. So, of course, for them, if the stake is now going to be taken away from them, they need to be able to understand exactly what the deal merits were and what the deal demerits were. So that's how it all started. The problem that now emerges is that we then hear that, well, actually, at the point of transfer, which is essentially the state saying there's currently one share certificate, it says 100 shares belong to the South African citizens. We want to transfer 51 of those shares to Takatso and we'll retain 49 of those shares. What they needed to do was to simply process a transaction. It's a nominal transaction. It's not really a reflection of the value of the airline. And it simply says that in order for me to give you 51 of the 100 shares that I own, you need to give me a rand for each share. So that's where the 51 rand comes from. It is not actually a reflection of the assets or otherwise of SAA.
So, and thanks for that explanation, because you know the trust deficit that exists between the South African government and its citizens. And obviously, those were the headlines that were running this week, that 51 Rand, 1 Rand for each share. And so if you're speaking to people now in layman's terms, what do you think is important for them to know about this particular deal, what we know about it, and where it's at?
Well, what's really important is that the stake, the 51%, has been passed on to Takatso essentially for no payment. And the reason we have to say it's been passed on for no payment is that the closest you get to a number as far as this transaction is concerned is that you hear about the 3 billion Rand. So when you hear about 3 billion Rand, it actually turns out to be the number that when Takatso did its own preliminary assessment of the deal last year, they felt that if they could put in 3 billion Rand it would be enable them to start up SAA. Remember, of course, not only had there been a business rescue process, but there was also the universal lockdowns from COVID-19. So essentially, SAA wasn't operating. So they came up with the number that said that we think it's going to take us 3 billion rand to be able to get back into the skies. So that is the closest that we ever got to a number. So those are the only two numbers that we have, the 3 billion rand and the 51 rand. So what South African citizens need to sort of make peace with is that the stake has been passed for no payment from Takatso, because they haven't had to pay anything in relation to the previous ownership stake. They haven't had to pay anything in order to acquire the 51%. They've only had to say that if we do receive the 51% stake, if we do get given the right to run the airline, we're going to put in 3 billion rand just to get it through the first few months, or even maybe the majority of the first year, until we get back into the skies. So it's been a transfer where the South African citizens have yet to receive a single cent. And of course, we're happy for the department to rebut this by giving us information that proves otherwise.
So Minister Gordhan sent out a media release clarifying some of the terms of the disposal of that 51% stake. And just speaking to that 3 billion rand, in terms of financial contributions that are to be made, it says the consortium will provide 3 billion rand working capital to the new airline, and government makes no contribution at all to the working capital of SAA. However, we know that SAA has already taken to the skies again. So who is funding that at the moment?
Well, the problem is that SAA went back into the skies sometime in the middle of last year. And at that point in time, remember, Takatso's 3 billion rand had been based on what they thought the conditions were going to be at that particular state. We do not know whether, with the benefit of hindsight, they have now worked out that it costs a bit more than 3 billion rand or a bit less than 3 billion rand to get back into the sky. So again, the information deficit is not helping us here. So of course, what you've just highlighted is a very important issue, is that they've always been clear that this is for working capital. In other words, they were not paying the department to say, okay, please give us 51% of SAA. They were simply saying, give us 51% of SAA, and once we have that 51%, we will run it on our own terms, and we have a suspicion that it's going to cost us 3 billion rand to get it back into the skies. So how SAA has then been running since then is a matter of speculation, and of course, until Takatso is willing to give us the insights into whether it's only cost them 3 billion rand to get back into the sky since then. And of course, I can tell you right now, that's completely untrue. It costs a lot more to get back into the skies. That information deficit is not helping at all. The other possibility is that once they had said that we're taking this back into the skies, then other lenders, whether it's the banks or other financing agents, would have then said, okay, cool, now that we can see that it's going back into the skies, we are going to finance some of the operations, because 3 billion rand quite simply wouldn't have kept SAA viable since the time they started operating.
So in terms of ongoing liabilities, who's responsible for that?
Well, the taxpayers of South Africa are responsible for that, and I say the taxpayers of South Africa are responsible for that quite cautiously, because at the end of the day, this problem could have been resolved. The problem could have been resolved at the point of the business rescue process, and I've just gone through the business rescue proposal again, 110 boring pages, quite essentially. And even at the business rescue process, remember, there were always a couple of options. There was always the option of liquidation, which simply said, look, whoever you are that has been engaging with SAA since time immemorial, it has now come to the end of the road. We only have XYZ in the bank account, and we're going to share that amongst everybody who's entitled to something. So in a liquidation process, you would have killed off all of those historical liabilities and simply offered people whatever was available. That would have been the end of the story. Unfortunately, the Department of Public Enterprises in particular objected to the idea of the liquidation. The unions themselves also objected to the idea of a liquidation, because remember, the one key aspect of that is that in a liquidation, all contracts cease to exist, and that includes the employment contracts. So the trade-off here seems to have been, well, let us not liquidate. Let us go through a business rescue process. And that meant that some of those historical liabilities, which could have been killed off in a liquidation, actually still exist to today. So obviously, if there are all these historical liabilities amounting to the billions, you'd have to ask yourself a simple question of why anyone, any strategic equity provider, let alone Takatso, would sign up for a deal that forces them to pay for liabilities that they were simply not responsible for because it predated them. So it was always clear that on the business modeling basis, it was impossible or completely illogical for Takatso to sign up for those liabilities. And of course, because the government refused to let the liabilities die when an opportunity existed through a liquidation process, it simply means that those liabilities are going to be revived in one form or another. And when they do get revived, it will simply mean that the state must step in, because Takatso will always say that has nothing to do with us. You can see the date of that liability was long before we came into the picture. So therefore, you as the state are responsible for it.
So, Kaya, it all sounds very convoluted, but it's rather mind-boggling. So we have 30 seconds. If you could just bottom line it for us. So essentially, we gave away 51% of SAA for nothing, really. We just gave it away.
Yeah, that's the long and short of it. And that's simply based on the basis that perhaps SAA was worthless at the point of transfer. But again, until the Department of Public Enterprises gives us insight into the deal and the deal merits and what exactly has been put together, it's all a matter of speculation. But as it stands today, 51% of SAA is gone. The South African state has not received a single cent except perhaps 51 rand, which even you and I could have paid. And that's the long and short of it. SAA is gone, and you're not going to receive anything except an invoice that will emerge in the future that says, oh, by the way, here's a liability that actually relates to a period before Takatso came in, so you as citizens must pay for it.
So we're told it's a drain on the fiscus. The South African taxpayer won't have to pay anything, but in the meantime, we are still paying. Well,
yeah, I suppose the reality is that if we took that seriously, if we took that statement seriously to say that there'll never be a payment in the future, then we are equally to blame for having been remarkably naive. I mean, anyone who understood the business of SAA and anyone who understood the implication of the state saying no to liquidation should have known that these liabilities were not going to disappear. And of course, this is where we are today. And as I said, South African citizens are indeed responsible for this, because who has done this? The government we put in power.
Kaya, thanks so much for your time this morning. Pause, definitely a pause on that conversation. Kaya Sithole, chartered accountant and analyst on the latest developments around the sale of South African Airways.